The smell of expensive lilies always gives me a headache, but that afternoon in the bridal suite, the scent was thick enough to choke the truth right out of the air. I was sitting in the far corner, my hands resting on my lap, smoothed over the silk of a dress that cost more than my first car. My son, Robert, was standing by the window with his father-in-law, Frank. They didn't think I could hear them over the frantic chirping of the bridesmaids, but sound carries differently when you've spent 40 years listening for the shift in a person's heartbeat. Frank leaned in, his voice a low, oily murmur, and told Robert that the head table was getting a bit crowded. He said it would look more uniform if the high-profile donors and the young, photogenic couples took the primary seats. He suggested, with a pat on Robert's shoulder, that I might be more comfortable tucked away at table 14, the one behind the pillar near the kitchen doors. Robert didn't flinch. He didn't defend the woman who had worked double shifts at the hospital for 2 decades to ensure his hands never grew calluses. He just nodded, checked his gold watch, and said it was probably for the best, so I wouldn't be overwhelmed by the noise. They weren't just moving my seat. They were moving me out of the narrative of his success. I realized then that they weren't planning a wedding. They were planning an erasure. It was a bold move to try and hide the foundation of a house while you're still standing on the roof. I am a woman of quiet rhythms and ironclad ledgers. My name is Judith Nash, and I have spent 68 years learning that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the least to lose. I wasn't born into the world of country clubs and silent auctions that Frank inhabits. I earned my way into it by being the person who remembered the fine print while everyone else was distracted by the headline. I spent 30 years as a head floor nurse, a job that requires you to see the crisis before it happens. I have raised a son, buried a husband, and built a portfolio through the kind of discipline that looks like deprivation to the uninitiated. I don't fund dreams based on potential. I fund structures based on stability. When Robert wanted to start his architectural firm, I didn't just give him a blessing. I gave him the seed money, the down payment on his office lease, and the collateral for his first 3 major contracts. I was the silent partner in his rise, the invisible hand that kept him upright when the market fluctuated. I have always been content to stay in the shadows of his achievements, provided the foundation remained respected. But there is a vast difference between being a silent partner and being a silenced mother. The betrayal wasn't the seating chart itself. It was the casualness of the exclusion. It was the way Frank looked at me, not as the woman who had financed his son-in-law's career, but as a decorative relic of a past life that no longer matched the decor. Frank is a man who believes that power is something you wear like a suit rather than something you carry in your character. He assumed that because I am soft-spoken and elderly, I am also unaware. He assumed that my silence was a sign of submission rather than a period of observation. As I sat in that suite, watching them erase my name from the VIP list, I felt a familiar stillness settle over me. It is the same stillness I felt when a surgeon told me a case was hopeless. It is the clarity that comes when you stop hoping for a person to be better and start accepting who they actually are. Robert looked at me once, a brief, guilty flicker in his eyes, before he turned back to Frank to laugh at a joke I couldn't hear. He had traded his history for a seat at a table that didn't belong to him. He forgot that while he might be the face of the firm, I am the one who holds the keys to the building. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene or demand my rightful place at the front of the room. I simply stood up, smoothed my dress once more, and walked out of the suite. Silence is a remarkable tool. It allows people to fill the void with their own arrogance until they eventually trip over it. I went home and sat in my study, the room where every major decision of my life has been calculated. I pulled out the original operating agreement for Nash and Associates. I looked at the clauses regarding capital calls and ownership transfers. I reviewed the bank records for the trust that pays the lease on the very venue where this wedding was supposed to take place. People often mistake kindness for a lack of options. They think that because you chose to help them, you are now obligated to continue doing so, regardless of how they treat you. They forget that a bridge that can be built can also be closed for maintenance. If they wanted a wedding that looked perfect for the cameras, without the clutter of the woman who made it possible, I was more than happy to give them exactly what they asked for. I would become entirely invisible. The consequence of treating someone like they don't matter is that you eventually lose the right to matter to them. Frank and Robert wanted a high society event stripped of the burden of family loyalty. They wanted the prestige without the person. Fine, but prestige has a price tag. And in this family, I am the one who signs the checks. As I sat there in the quiet of my home, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It sounded like a countdown. They thought they were putting me in the back of the room to save face. They didn't realize that by removing me from the table, they were removing the only thing keeping the table from collapsing. I wasn't angry. Anger is a leak in your energy. I was simply moving my assets to a more secure location. The wedding was 48 hours away, and the final payments were due by noon the next day. I wondered how the uniform look of the head table would hold up when the venue realized the primary account had been frozen. They think they've won because they've secured the girl and the prestige, but they've forgotten who owns the ground they're walking on. This isn't a story about a bitter grandmother. It's a lesson and the power of setting boundaries. If you think I'm just going to sit behind that pillar and watch them toast to a life I paid for, you don't know me at all. What happens next isn't an outburst. It's an audit. You'll want to see how this balance sheet levels out. If you believe that dignity is not negotiable and that betrayal deserves a structural response, subscribe to Vintage Vengeance. Click the notification bell because the bills come due and the silence gets even louder. You won't want to miss the moment the music stops. The house was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a steady mechanical pulse that reminded me of the hospital monitors I'd spent half my life watching. I sat at my mahogany desk. The wood cool beneath my palms. On the surface lay the wedding contract for the Grand Oaks estate. It was a beautiful document, embossed with gold foil, detailing the lobster tails, the vintage champagne, and the floral arrangements that cost as much as a mid-sized sedan. My signature was at the bottom of the final page. In the world of business, the person who signs the check owns the silence. Frank and Robert had spent months treating me like a guest at my own investment, a spectator to their grand social debut. They didn't realize that when you treat a benefactor like an ornament, the ornament might just decide to stop decorating the room. I picked up my fountain pen, the weight of it familiar and grounding. There is a specific kind of peace that comes when you stop trying to be understood by people who are committed to misunderstanding you. I have never been a woman of impulse. When Robert was 6 and broke a neighbor's window, I didn't yell. I sat him down and showed him the ledger of his allowance and how many weeks of chores it would take to replace the glass. I taught him that every action has a mathematical equivalent in consequence. It seems he'd forgotten that lesson in his haste to impress Frank. Frank represents a world of inherited confidence, the kind of man who believes the floor will always be there simply because he has never had to build one. He looked at my savings, my property, and my quiet life, and he saw a resource to be tapped, not a person to be respected. He saw an elderly woman who would surely be grateful just to be invited to the party. He didn't see the woman who had negotiated union contracts and managed surgical budgets. He didn't see the strategist. He only saw the seating chart. I placed a call to the event coordinator at Grand Oaks, a woman named Cynthia, who had been very helpful when I was the one wiring the initial deposits. Her voice was bright, the practiced cheer of someone who deals in fairy tales. I informed her with the same professional tone I use to discharge patients. that there had been a change in the financial structure of the event. I told her that as of 10 o'clock that morning, I was withdrawing my personal guarantee for the remaining balance. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. It was the sound of a fairy tale hitting the pavement. Cynthia stammered about the finality of the arrangements and the unfortunate timing, given the wedding was only 2 days away. I told her I understood perfectly. I also reminded her that according to Section 4, Paragraph C of the contract I had drafted, the primary guarantor has the right to revoke funding up to 48 hours before the event if material changes to the guest of honor's status occurred. My status had changed. I was no longer the mother of the groom. I was the woman at table 14. And the woman at table 14 does not pay for the lobster. After I hung up, I felt a lightness in my chest that had been missing for months. This wasn't about elderly revenge in the way people see it in the movies. No tires were slashed, no drinks were thrown. This was senior justice. It was the simple act of removing my hands from a situation that no longer deserved my support. I am 68 years old, and I have learned that you cannot buy respect, but you can certainly stop subsidizing disrespect. Robert had spent the last year letting Frank dictate every detail of this wedding, from the guest list to the venue, all while using my credit line to secure the bookings. He thought he could have Frank's prestige and my pocketbook at the same time. He thought I was too traditional to disrupt his big day. He confused my patience for a lack of boundaries. I spent the rest of the afternoon in my garden pruning the roses. You have to be careful when you prune. If you're too timid, the dead weight chokes the new growth. If you're too aggressive, you damage the heart of the plant. I worked with precision, the sun warm on my neck. I knew that within the hour, the phone calls would start. The venue would call Robert. Robert would call Frank. And eventually, they would both have to realize that the uniform look they wanted for their head table was about to be ruined by the very thing they tried to hide, the reality of who was actually in charge. Standing up for yourself doesn't always require a shout. Sometimes it just requires a pen and a quiet room. I saw Robert's name flash on my phone screen as I was washing the dirt from my hands. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to discuss that hadn't already been said by his silence in the bridal suite. If he wanted to be the man Frank wanted him to be, a man of status and independent wealth, then this was his opportunity to prove it. He could find the $60,000 for the remaining balance on his own. He could see if Frank's high-profile donors were willing to pay for his wedding cake. I let the phone ring until it stopped, the silence returning to the house like a loyal friend. Quiet power is knowing that you don't have to pick up the phone to win the argument. The argument was already over. The sun began to set, casting long, elegant shadows across my living room. I poured myself a small glass of sherry and sat by the window. I wasn't waiting for a miracle. I was waiting for the inevitable. When you remove the foundation, the house doesn't fall immediately. First, there are the cracks. Then, there is the settling. Finally, there is the realization that everything you thought was solid was actually just hovering in the air. Tomorrow, the cracks would start to show at the Grand Oaks estate, and I would be right here in my comfortable chair, finally enjoying the peace I had paid for. The vibration of my cell phone on the marble countertop sounded like a swarm of angry bees. It was a rhythmic, persistent intrusion that I ignored with the practiced ease of a woman who has spent 30 years silencing alarms in a recovery room. I didn't need to look at the screen to know it was Robert. I could almost see him, standing in his designer suit, pacing the floor of his office, his face flushed with the sudden realization that the safety net he had taken for granted had just dissolved. He wouldn't be calling to apologize for the seating chart. He wouldn't be calling to ask if I was hurt. He was calling because the venue had just informed him that the final payment of $60,000 hadn't cleared, and his own credit cards were already pushed to their limits by the honeymoon suite, and the custom Italian shoes Frank had insisted he buy. He was calling because the fantasy was leaking, and he expected me to bring the bucket. I poured myself a cup of herbal tea, the steam rising in a slow, elegant curl. Silence is a curious thing. To some, it is a void to be feared, but to me, it is a tool of measurement. By not answering, I was forcing Robert to sit with his own choices. In the hospital, we called it watchful waiting. You don't always need to intervene to know how a situation will progress. Sometimes you just have to let the symptoms manifest. Robert had spent his entire adult life believing that my resources were an extension of his own identity. He viewed my financial independence as a family utility like water or electricity, something that should always be running in the background, regardless of how he treated the source. He had confused maternal love with a perpetual subsidy. The phone fell silent for 3 minutes before it began to scream again. This time, it was Frank's number. I felt a thin, cold smile touch my lips. Frank, the man of uniform, aesthetics, and high-profile donors, was finally lowering himself to call the woman he had tried to tuck behind a pillar. He was likely panicking. Men like Frank don't handle structural failure well. They prefer to delegate the repairs. He had probably spent the last hour trying to convince Robert to handle his mother, only to realize that Robert had no handle left to grasp. I let it ring. I let the sound echo off the walls of my quiet, paid-for home. I wanted them to feel the weight of that silence. I wanted them to understand that the person they had dismissed as an elderly inconvenience was actually the only person holding their social standing together. There is a specific kind of arrogance in thinking you can insult someone and then immediately ask them for a favor. It reveals a deep-seated belief that the other person doesn't have a memory or a spine. Frank and Robert had gambled on the idea that my grandmotherly wisdom would eventually lead to forgiveness and a signed check. They assumed that my desire to see my son married would outweigh my desire to be respected. They were wrong. Family betrayal isn't something you budget for. It's something you audit. And during my audit of the last 6 months, I realized I had been overinvesting in a relationship that provided zero returns in basic human decency. I walked over to the window and looked out at the street. It was a neighborhood of quiet power, well-kept lawns, sturdy houses, people who knew the value of a dollar because they had actually earned one. Robert wanted to live in a world of mirrors and smoke, where appearance was everything and the bill was always someone else's problem. He had allowed Frank to convince him that my presence at the wedding was a liability to his new image. He didn't realize that by cutting me out of the picture, he had cut the power to the lights. Without my guarantee, the Grand Oaks estate was just a very expensive garden with no catering and no music. I finally picked up the phone, not to answer, but to turn it off entirely. The screen went black, and for the first time in hours, the house was truly still. I wasn't being cruel. I was being clear. Setting boundaries isn't an act of war. It's an act of self-preservation. I had spent 40 years taking care of everyone else's emergencies. I was done being the emergency exit for people who wouldn't even let me through the front door. Tomorrow was the rehearsal dinner, and I had no intention of attending. I had a date with a good book and a glass of wine. They wanted me out of the way, and I was finally giving them exactly what they asked for. I was gone. The silence that followed the darkening of my phone screen was the most expensive sound in the world. For Robert and Frank, every minute that passed without my voice on the other end was costing them roughly $3,000 in venue retainers and floral deposits. I sat in my wingback chair, the leather cool and unyielding against my spine, and watched the dust motes dance in a stray beam of afternoon light. In my years on the hospital floor, I learned that the most critical moment in a crisis isn't the screaming. It's the quiet that comes right after the heart stops. That is when the reality of the situation truly sinks in. My son and his father-in-law were currently in the middle of a social cardiac arrest, and they were discovering that I was the only one who knew where the defibrillator was kept. I spent the evening reading a biography of a woman who had built a shipping empire from a single rowboat. It felt appropriate. My own empire was built from double shifts, careful budgeting, and the refusal to let anyone, man or child, mistake my kindness for a lack of vision. When Robert was in college, he used to call me his North Star. He said I was the only thing that kept him grounded. But once he started dating Frank's daughter and tasting the champagne of a life he hadn't yet earned, his North Star became an eyesore. I was a reminder of a past that didn't feature custom tuxedos and inherited titles. He wanted the fruit of my labor, but he was ashamed of the tree. He assumed that because I am a mother, my roots would never stop nourishing him, no matter how much salt he poured on the earth. Strategic silence is not about being petty. It is about creating a vacuum. When you stop responding to the demands of people who disregard you, they are forced to confront the structural integrity of their own lives. Without my financial guarantee, Robert had to face the staff at Grand Oaks as an equal, not as a legacy. He had to explain to Frank why the uniform wedding was suddenly lacking a caterer. I could imagine the conversation. Frank's face turning that specific shade of mahogany as he realized his daughter's wedding was about to become a local punchline because he had insulted the woman who held the purse strings. Frank is the kind of man who believes that elderly revenge is beneath him, but he is also the kind of man who cannot stomach the public embarrassment of a canceled reception. I realized then that I wasn't just setting boundaries. I was performing a necessary audit of my son's character. If Robert was willing to let me be tucked behind a pillar to satisfy a man he barely knew, then he was not the man I thought I had raised. He was a man who traded loyalty for proximity to power. My withdrawal wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a recalculation of risk. Why should I invest $60,000 into a union built on the exclusion of the very person who made it possible? Why should I fund a celebration where my presence is considered a blemish on the aesthetic? Financial independence is the ultimate shield, and that night I held it firmly. At 8 o'clock, I heard a car pull into my driveway. The headlights swept across my living room wall like a searchlight. I didn't move. I didn't turn on the porch light. I simply waited. I heard the heavy thud of a car door, followed by the hurried, uneven footsteps of someone who is losing their composure. A few seconds later, the rhythmic pounding on my front door began. It wasn't the polite knock of a son coming to visit his mother. It was the desperate drumming of a man whose house of cards was caught in a high wind. I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I have spent my life answering the call of people in pain. But Robert wasn't in pain. He was in a panic of his own making. The pounding continued for 5 minutes, punctuated by muffled shouts of my name. Then silence returned. I didn't peek through the curtains. I didn't check the doorbell camera. I knew that the silence would do more work than any argument ever could. When the car finally backed out of the driveway, the tires screeching slightly on the pavement, I felt a profound sense of relief. The first crack in the facade had appeared. Tomorrow was the day of the rehearsal dinner, the event that Frank had promised would be the social highlight of the season. I wondered how he planned to explain the closed for maintenance sign on the ballroom doors. I closed my book, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. I hadn't slept that soundly in years. The morning of the rehearsal dinner arrived with a clarity that only comes when you've stopped trying to carry other people's weight. I woke up at my usual time, 6 o'clock, and watched the sunrise bleed across the garden I had spent 20 years tending. In the hospital, we used to say that the morning shift was for assessment. You look at the charts, you check the vitals, and you prepare for the interventions. My assessment of the situation was simple. The wedding was scheduled for tomorrow, and the venue had a strict no pay, no play policy that Frank's prestige couldn't bypass. I spent my morning not in a frantic rush of hair appointments and dress fittings, but in the quiet companionship of my breakfast. I had eggs, toast, and a sense of autonomy that was worth more than any head table assignment. I knew exactly what was happening at the Grand Oaks estate. The staff would be setting up the linens, the florist would be unloading thousands of white roses, and the event coordinator would be checking her watch, waiting for the wire transfer that would never arrive. Robert would be there, likely looking over his shoulder every time a door opened, hoping his mother would walk in with a checkbook and a smile, ready to play the role of the forgiving matriarch. He had spent his life watching me solve problems, and he had mistaken my competence for a lack of limits. He assumed that my grandmother wisdom was just a soft pillow for him to land on whenever he fell. He didn't realize that wisdom is often a mirror, and today he was going to have to look at exactly who he had become. By noon, the frantic energy of the outside world began to leak back into my space. My landline, the one I keep for emergencies and old friends, started to ring. I didn't answer, but I didn't unplug it. I let the machine take the messages. The first was from Robert, his voice tight and unnervingly high. He didn't mention the seating chart. He didn't mention Frank. He only mentioned the misunderstanding at the bank and how we needed to clear it up before the rehearsal started at 5. The use of the word "we" was a fascinating piece of psychological gymnastics. There was no "we" in the decision to move me to table 14. There was no "we" when they were laughing about the photogenic guests. "We" is the word people use when they want you to share their failure, but never their success. The second message was from Frank. It was shorter, colder, and vibrated with the suppressed rage of a man who realized his bluff had been called. He didn't apologize. He simply stated that this behavior was beneath a woman of my standing and that I was jeopardizing the happiness of my own son over a minor clerical detail. To Frank, my dignity was a clerical detail. My history of sacrifice was a footnote. He truly believed that I owed him my silence and my money because he had allowed my son into his social circle. He didn't understand that I wasn't jeopardizing Robert's happiness. I was letting Robert experience the natural consequences of his own loyalty, or lack thereof. If your happiness is built on the erasure of your mother, it's not happiness. It's a heist. I spent the afternoon at the local library. I've always found peace among the stacks, the smell of old paper, and the hushed respect for knowledge. I wasn't hiding. I was simply being elsewhere. When you have quiet power, you don't need to stand in the middle of the room to be felt. Your absence creates a shape that everyone has to walk around. I sat in a sunlit corner and read about the reconstruction of ancient cities. It reminded me that sometimes you have to let the old crooked structures fall completely before you can build something with a true level. I wasn't interested in a satisfying revenge that involved shouting matches. I was interested in a structural realignment. As 5 o'clock approached, the hour the rehearsal was meant to begin, I walked back to my house. The air was cooling, and the shadows of the oaks were stretching long and thin across the pavement. I imagined the scene at the estate. The bride in her white dress, the bridesmaids holding their bouquets, and the grooms standing at the altar of a ballroom that was effectively a crime scene of unpaid invoices. I imagined the look on Frank's face when the manager finally pulled him aside to explain that the uniform look of the evening would now include the lights being dimmed and the doors being locked. I sat on my porch and watched the street lights flicker to life. The silence was doing the work now. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. The clock struck 6, and I remained on my porch, wrapped in a pashmina that had seen more winters than Robert had seen business deals. At the Grand Oaks estate, the rehearsal dinner should have been in full swing. There should have been the clinking of crystal and the rehearsed laughter of people who believe that social standing is a shield against consequence. Instead, I imagined the cooling plates of hors d'oeuvres and the growing, jagged silence of a room where the bill hadn't been settled. In my world, structure is everything. If the foundation is cracked, the chandelier will eventually fall. It doesn't matter how much you polish the brass, gravity always wins. I had spent my life as a nurse seeing people at their most vulnerable, and I knew that panic has a specific scent. It smells like sour sweat and expensive cologne. I could almost smell it on Frank from 5 miles away. A man like Frank doesn't know how to handle a no that he can't talk his way out of. He spent his career moving numbers around on a screen, but the manager of a high-end venue doesn't care about numbers on a screen. They care about the cleared funds in their operating account. I had moved my money into a private trust 2 months ago, a quiet financial independence move that Robert had ignored because he was too busy picking out the thread count for his custom shirts. By 7 o'clock, the headlights reappeared. This time, it wasn't just one car. It was Robert's sleek German coupe followed by Frank's heavy, black SUV. They pulled up to the curb with a clinical precision that suggested a coordinated assault. I didn't retreat inside. I sat right there in my wicker chair, a queen on a porch swing throne. I watched them step out, Robert looking disheveled, his tie loosened, and Frank looking like a man who was prepared to deliver a lecture on family unity. They walked up my path, their shoes crunching on the gravel I had paid for, and stopped at the bottom of my stairs. Silence sat between us like a third party, uninvited and immovable. "Mom," Robert started, his voice cracking just enough to remind me of the boy who used to cry over a scraped knee. "The venue, they locked the doors. They said the payment didn't go through. They said you revoked the guarantee. Everyone is standing in the parking lot, Mom. Frank's friends, the wedding party, it's a nightmare." He didn't ask how I was. He didn't apologize for the seating chart. He jumped straight to the nightmare of his own social embarrassment. He was looking for a savior, not a mother. He wanted me to reach into my purse and hand him his dignity back, unaware that dignity is the one thing you can't buy on credit. Frank took a step forward, his chest puffed out like a pigeon in a suit. "Judith, let's be reasonable," he said, his voice dripping with that patronizing tone men use when they think a woman is being emotional. "Whatever slight you feel you've suffered, this is hardly the time for a tantrum. You're embarrassing your son. You're embarrassing me. Just call the coordinator, give them the card number, and we can move past this minor disagreement." He actually used the word tantrum. He saw my boundary as a temper problem. He saw my self-respect as a glitch in his spreadsheet. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at him until his gaze flickered away. "Frank," I said, the name tasting like ash. "A tantrum is what a child does when they don't get their way. An audit is what a professional does when the books don't balance. I am simply balancing the books." I turned my eyes to Robert, who looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. "You told me the head table was for people who contributed to the uniform success of your new life. Since I am apparently just a clerical detail at table 14, I decided to act like one. A detail doesn't pay the mortgage on a dream it isn't invited to share. If you want a wedding that matches Frank's aesthetic, then Frank should be the one to fund the canvas." The silence that followed was heavy enough to break the floorboards. Robert stood on the bottom step, his face pale under the amber glow of my porch light. For a moment, he looked exactly like he did when he was 10 years old and had been caught in a lie, shoulders slumped, eyes darting, looking for an exit that didn't involve an apology. Frank, however, wasn't looking for an exit. He was looking for a leverage point. He adjusted his cufflinks, a habit he has when he's trying to regain a sense of authority he hasn't earned. He looked at my modest home, then back at me, his lip curling just enough to show his disdain for the smallness of my world. He didn't realize that a small house with no debt is a fortress, while a mansion built on someone else's back is just a very expensive tent. "Judith, you're being incredibly short-sighted," Frank said, his voice dropping into that deep, gravelly tone he used for boardrooms. "Do you have any idea the caliber of people standing in that parking lot? Judges, developers, the very people who can make or break Robert's career. You are sabotaging your own son's future over a seating arrangement. It's petty. It's beneath a woman of your age. If you don't fix this tonight, the reputational damage to the Nash name will be permanent. Is that what you want? To be the woman who ruined her son's life because she didn't like her chair?" He was trying to frame my self-respect as a weapon of destruction. He wanted me to feel the weight of Robert's failure as if it were my own. I leaned back in my chair, the wicker creaking softly, the only sound in the night. "Frank," I said, my voice as steady as a heart rate on a healthy monitor. The reputation of the Nash name was built on 30 years of nursing and 20 years of smart investing. It wasn't built on being a silent ATM for men who view me as a decorative inconvenience. If Robert's career is so fragile that it breaks because a party was canceled, then he hasn't built a career. He's built a hobby. And as for the seating arrangement, you didn't just give me a chair at the back of the room. You gave me an exit. I simply decided to take it. Silence fell again, doing the heavy lifting of making Frank's arrogance look like the hollow shell it was. Robert finally spoke, his voice a jagged whisper. "Mom, please. Just this once. I'll make it up to you. I'll change the seating. I'll put you right next to me. Just the caterer needs the wire by midnight, or they won't even show up tomorrow morning. The guests are already starting to tweet about the venue issues. It's going viral, Mom. People think we're broke." There it was, the true fear. It wasn't about the wedding or the union. It was about the appearance of poverty. To Robert and Frank, being broke was a sin worse than being ungrateful. They were terrified of the world seeing the truth, that they were living a life they couldn't afford on a foundation they hadn't respected. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw the man Frank had shaped. A man who thought loyalty was a commodity you could trade up when a better offer came along. I felt a pang of grief, but it was a clean grief, like the sting of antiseptic on a wound. "Robert," I said, "you don't need my money to have a wedding. You need a priest and a license. If you want the lobster and the gold leaf invitations, you need to find the character to pay for them yourself. You can't ask the person you've insulted to fund the insult. That's not how math works. And it's certainly not how I raised you." I stood up, signaling that the audience was over. They stood there for a long beat, the two of them looking up at me from the shadows. I saw the moment Frank realized that his high-profile status meant nothing in the face of a woman who didn't want anything from him. I saw the moment Robert realized that the bank was truly closed. There was no shouting, no dramatic flair. I simply turned and walked toward my front door. I didn't look back to see them walk to their cars. I didn't wait to hear the engines start. I went inside and locked the door, not because I was afraid, but because I was finished. The audit was complete, and the balance was 0. The morning of the wedding arrived with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. I sat on my back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the squirrels navigate the oak trees with more grace than my son had shown in a year. Today was supposed to be the day of the white lace, the 5-tier cake, and the carefully curated social climbing. Instead, it was just Saturday. There were no frantic phone calls from makeup artists, no steam cleaning of veils, and no orchestrated chaos. I had spent the night sleeping the deep, restorative sleep of the blameless. When you stop trying to fix a structural collapse that you didn't cause, you find that your hands are suddenly very light. I knew that across town, at the Grand Oaks estate, the gates remained locked. I could picture the scene. the florist's been idling at the entrance, the driver checking his clipboard while the white roses wilted in the heat. I could imagine the catering staff being redirected to other events, their silver trays and silk linens packed back into the trucks. Robert and Frank had spent months building a stage, but they had forgotten that a stage requires a floor. Without my final wire transfer, the venue was just a quiet park with expensive landscaping. They had gambled on the idea that a mother's grandmother wisdom would always include a blank check. They didn't realize that true wisdom is knowing when to stop throwing good money after bad character. Around 10 o'clock, my daughter-in-law-to-be, Felicia, called. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice was thin, reeking of the same entitlement that Frank had cultivated. She didn't ask how I was. She demanded to know why I was doing this to her special day. She spoke about the photographers she had flown in from New York and the social media influencers who were expecting a content-rich event. To her, I wasn't a family member. I was a line item that had failed to clear. She didn't see the irony of calling me a toxic influence while begging for my bank account. I deleted the message. I don't engage with noise when I have already committed to the truth. I spent the afternoon doing something I hadn't done in years. I went for a long, slow walk through the botanical gardens. I watched young couples taking pictures and children chasing ducks. I realized that for the last 2 years, I had been an auxiliary character in Robert's life, a silent funder of a lifestyle that didn't include me. I had been paying for the privilege of being ignored. It was a realization that didn't bring anger, only a cold, clinical clarity. If you pay for someone's life, you are not helping them grow, you are helping them pretend. By stepping back, I was finally giving Robert the gift of reality. It was the most maternal thing I had done for him in a decade. The sun began its slow descent, the golden hour that photographers love so much. This was the hour the ceremony was meant to begin. I sat on a park bench and looked at my watch. At this exact moment, Robert should have been standing at the altar, looking out at a sea of photogenic guests. Instead, he was likely in a frantic meeting in Frank's study, trying to figure out how to explain the technical difficulties to 500 people. He was discovering that quiet power is much harder to maintain when the lights aren't on. He was learning that respect is the only currency that doesn't lose its value when the market crashes. I walked back to my car, the evening air cool against my face. I felt a sense of peace that was almost surgical in its precision. I had set a boundary, and for the first time in my life, I hadn't apologized for it. I wasn't the woman who ruined a wedding. I was the woman who stopped subsidizing her own exclusion. As I drove home, I saw a billboard for a luxury jewelry store, the kind of place Frank frequented. It said, "Invest in Forever." I laughed softly to myself. I had invested in Forever for 30 years, and today I finally took my dividends in the form of my own dignity. The evening of what was supposed to be the wedding of the decade arrived with a stillness that felt like a clean slate. I sat in my dining room, the table set for one with a simple meal of roasted chicken and seasonal vegetables. No lobster, no gold leaf garnish, just sustenance. Across town, the local news had already picked up a small segment about a glitch at the Grand Oaks estate that left hundreds of socially prominent guests standing in a parking lot. They called it an administrative error. I called it a reality check. Robert and Frank had spent months curating a masterpiece of prestige, only to realize they had forgotten to buy the canvas. I spent the hour reading through old letters from my late husband. He was a man who understood that a house is only as strong as its joists. He used to say that the most dangerous person is the one who thinks they are too important to say thank you. He would have looked at Robert and Frank with a quiet, disappointed sigh, then returned to his woodworking. He knew, as I know, that you cannot shame a person into loving you, but you can certainly stop paying for the privilege of their contempt. I felt his presence in the room. A steady, anchoring memory that reminded me that my value isn't determined by where I sit at a table, but by whose blood runs through the veins of the people I raised. Around 9 o'clock, the final wave of messages arrived. They were different now. The anger had been replaced by a hollow, desperate bargaining. Robert sent a long text detailing how the humiliation was complete and that Frank's daughter was inconsolable. He asked if this was what I wanted, to see him broken. He still didn't understand. I didn't want him broken. I wanted him awake. I wanted him to see that the world Frank offered him was a world of ghosts and mirrors. If he was broken by the loss of a party, then he was never truly whole to begin with. He was grieving a lifestyle, not a relationship. I looked at the photos of Robert on my mantle, the graduation, the first day at the firm, the moments where he still looked like the boy I had sacrificed everything for. I didn't feel a need to take them down. Those moments were real, but they were also paid for in full. I had fulfilled my contract as a mother. I had provided the education, the capital, and the character training. If he chose to discard the training for the sake of a seating chart, that was his ledger to balance, not mine. I felt a profound sense of financial independence, not just from banks, but from the emotional debt of other people's expectations. I walked through my house, turning off the lights one by one. Each click felt like a period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. I wasn't being cold. I was being finished. There is a specific kind of grandmother wisdom that knows when the healing is over and the scarring has begun. You don't keep picking at a wound if you want it to close. I had closed the account. I had withdrawn the support. I had set a boundary that was as tall and unyielding as the oaks in my yard. Tomorrow, the sun would rise on a world where Robert would have to start building something that actually belonged to him. I sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the house settle. It is a sturdy house built with honest labor and maintained with careful attention. It doesn't need a head table to be significant. It doesn't need Frank's approval to be a home. I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the phone to ring. I wasn't bracing for the next demand or the next subtle insult. I was just Judith Nash, a woman who had lived long enough to know the difference between being needed and being used. I closed my eyes and let the silence carry me into sleep. The Monday after the wedding that never was felt like any other Monday, which is the most terrifying thing about consequence. The world keeps turning even when your ego has been shattered. I spent the morning in my sunroom, the light hitting the mahogany desk where I've managed my household for 40 years. My son, Robert, had sent a final, long-winded email late Sunday night. It wasn't an apology. It was an itemized list of his humiliations. He spoke about the social suicide of the canceled event and how Frank's daughter had retreated to a spa to recover from the trauma. He blamed my silence for the death of his reputation. He still didn't understand that I didn't kill his reputation. I simply stopped paying the life support for a ghost. I didn't reply. Some debts are too large to be settled with words, and some people are too poor in character to ever pay them back. I spent the afternoon at my bank, meeting with my advisor to finalize the transfer of the remaining wedding funds into a private scholarship for nursing students, young women who understand that a career is built on the floor, not in a ballroom. It felt like the ultimate act of senior justice. That money, which was intended to buy lobster for people who looked down on me, would now buy textbooks for people who will one day save lives. I am not a woman who funds dreams based on aesthetics. I fund structures built on service. As I walked out of the bank, I saw Frank's black SUV idling at a red light. For a split second, our eyes met through the tinted glass. He looked older. The practiced sheen of his authority had cracked, replaced by the hollowing realization that his high-profile connections couldn't force a venue to open its doors without a check. I didn't nod. I didn't smirk. I simply stepped onto the curb and kept walking. Silence is the only language a man like Frank truly fears because he cannot manipulate a void. He had spent his life trying to manage me, only to find out that I am the one who managed the very ground he was standing on. Robert will eventually call again. He will run out of Frank's patience or Frank's daughter's grace, and he will come looking for the grandmother wisdom he once mocked. But the version of me that existed to absorb his disrespect is gone. Setting boundaries isn't about building a wall to keep people out. It's about building a gate so you can decide who is worthy of coming in. I have reclaimed my dignity, not through a loud confrontation, but through the steady, unwavering application of my own standards. I am 68 years old, and for the first time, my life is entirely my own. I returned home and sat in my garden, the roses finally in full bloom. The air was still, and the neighborhood was quiet. There is a specific kind of peace that comes when you stop subsidizing your own erasure. I am not bitter. I am clean. I have audited my life, settled the accounts, and walked away from a bad investment with my soul intact. My son and his father-in-law wanted to erase me from the wedding after all I did, so I made sure the only thing they had left to remember me by was the sound of the lights turning off. Family betrayal is a heavy price, but the freedom that follows is priceless. If you've ever been underestimated because of your age or pushed to the back of the room by people who should have honored you, remember this. Your power isn't in your voice. It's in your signature. You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to stop funding the noise. This is not the end, but the beginning of a life lived on my own terms. If you're ready to stop being the silent partner in your own disrespect and start setting boundaries, hit that like button and subscribe to Vintage Vengeance. Share this with one person who needs to hear that their dignity is not for sale. Comment below if you reclaimed your seat at the head of your own life. Watch our next video to see how a grandmother handled an entitled heir who tried to sell her home out from under her.